Together, growing in faith, changing communities. Once again, welcome back, dear friends, to this our series, The Women in the Scriptures, the Women in the Bible series. And today we are looking at a very interesting character. Her name is Tamar or Tamar, depending how you want to pronounce her name. Her name also could be called or pronounced as Tamara or Tamara. She is an interesting character. She is found in the book of Genesis chapter 38. Now, let me once again share and declare this up front. What I'm about to share with you, as I share with all the sessions that I have with you, are my insights into the text. It's what I have read into the text, and it's what I would like to share into the text. And some of the things that I may say may be different to how some people are thinking, and that's intentionally done, because the purpose of my sharing is to create a conversation. And in creating a conversation, I strongly believe that our understanding of the text becomes a little bit richer than what we had known before. Because if I share what I see and what I read into the text, and you do the same and you leave me the comments, and so the dialogue continues and the discussion continues, and what more than a rich and a healthier way of reading a text than when both of us can dialogue about the text. You share how you feel and your experiences of life pertaining to this text. And so in looking at Genesis chapter 38, this for me becomes a very beautiful character. Number one, Tamar has a whole chapter dedicated to her. If you remember in the previous session, I looked at different characters, and one of the characters I had looked into was Potiphar's wife. And in that chapter, in Potiphar's wife was not the main character. That chapter is written with Joseph in mind. So Potiphar's wife is caught between Joseph and the husband Potiphar. And the story is totally different in chapter 38, because here in chapter 38, the main character is Tamar herself. Now, what makes Tamar so important to me is that if you read the Gospel of Matthew chapter 1, the so-called genealogy of Jesus Christ, the family tree of Jesus Christ, one thing you will have to notice is that that family tree has male characters, and there are only few female characters, and Tamar is one of those female characters. So Tamar belongs in the family tree of Jesus. And so whatever we're going to read now in the Hebrew Bible, in the so-called Old Testament, always keep that in mind as you go to the New Testament, especially if you want to understand the life of Jesus Christ. Let's begin then in verse 1. About that time, Judah parted from his brothers and pitched his tent near a certain Adullamite named Hiram. And there he met the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. He married her and had relations with her. She conceived and gave birth to 3 sons. Now, let's begin here. The Judah we are talking about is the brother of Joseph. And now, if you want to look at this thing from a scriptural background, you know that we've been talking about Joseph. And if you've been reading your Genesis, you know chapter 36, 37 talks about Joseph. And in chapter 38, we're no longer talking about Joseph, but now we talk about Judah. We talk about Tamar. Chapter 39, we go back to the Joseph story. So this story is like an insertion into the Joseph narrative. But there's something interesting. We always need to see and look for a link if it is there. And we know the link that Judah that we are talking about now is the brother to Joseph, but also he is the son of Israel or of Jacob. Interestingly enough, Jesus Christ is born out of the house of Judah. So Judah, the one that we talk about, is one of the greatest patriarchs, because in his house, Jesus will be born. In his house, salvation will be born. If you keep that at the back of your mind, and as we analyze the character of Judah and the things that he does, then it will be very interesting to see how God allows these experiences and how God looks at all these experiences, and knowing all these experiences, he still makes sure that salvation is secured for his people, even though the family tree is not as clean, as pure as some of us may think. Now, we've read these couple of verses. We now know that Judah marries a Canaanite woman. And in marrying a Canaanite woman, she gives birth to 3 sons. The first one being Er, the second one is Onan, the third one is Shelah. Now, an interesting thing takes place. In verse 6, Judah got a wife named Tamar for his firstborn son, Have you ever heard of these organized marriages, arranged marriages? And some of us live in cultures where we still see and witness organized, arranged marriages. And whatever our opinion of the matter is, what I would like us to go back into is to realize that the experiences that some of us have seen in our lives is as old as it is found in the scriptures. What is the role of a woman in these arranged marriages? What is her take? Does she want to be part of this marriage? Is this coming from a strongly patriarchal environment? Is this a male-dominated era? What are the roles of these women? Do they have a choice? Now, we know that Judah got a wife for his son. But did Tamar want to marry Did Tamar agree to this arranged marriage? Was there love in this, or she only did that which was expected of her? The scriptures are silent about that. In this chapter, we don't know much about that. The only thing that we know is that this is an arranged marriage. We know that Tamar marries and we so know that Judah has an upper hand. Do you see Tamar as a victim? Do you see her as an innocent woman who's taken advantage of? Or do you see her as a woman who's submissive to this cultural, whether you want to call it dominance or you want to call it cultural practices? What are your take on these pre-arranged marriages? Let's move on. We know if we continue in verse 6 and in verse 7, but Judah's firstborn son, greatly offended the Lord, and the Lord was not pleased. We don't know what he did. Right, chapter 38 does not tell us. But it tells us that he offended the Lord. And for me, that is an important word. Underline that phrase. Offended the Lord. Why is it important? Because it will be of great importance to us from the word go to understand and to clearly accept that the author is not shy in telling us about the feelings of God if someone has done something utterly wrong. If someone has done something that offends God, the author is not afraid of telling us that the Lord is offended by the action of this person. Was the first one. The second one is Onan. When Judah realizes that his son has died, he asks Onan, and he says, Onan, go and marry Tamar and make sure that she gives birth to a son in honor of your brother. And Onan goes, unwillingly so, which is quite interesting. Onan is not willing to go and sleep with Tamar because he is afraid, or he doesn't like the fact that if Tamar becomes pregnant, the son that she gives birth to is not his, but belongs to his brother, who is late. And Onan does not like that. But it is not because he does not want to marry Tamar. Onan doesn't say anything about Tamar as, is she a beautiful woman? Is she willing to be with me? Does she love me? That's not the question. That's not the dialogue. The dialogue is about the children. And Onan says to himself, I want a woman who's going to give me my own children. But why doesn't Judah, why doesn't Onan, why doesn't the author tell us about the feelings of Tamar? Does Tamar want to marry Onan? Well, the text is silent. The text does not say anything. And so what does Onan do? Every time he goes and he has relations with Tamar, he makes sure that the seed, he spills them outside. And once again, the Lord is not pleased. The author tells us that the Lord was highly offended by what Onan had done. And because the Lord was offended with what Onan had done, what happens? Onan dies. Now let's go and read verse 9. Onan, however, knew that the descendants will not be counted as his. So whenever he had relations with his brother's widow, he wasted his seeds on the ground to avoid contributing offspring for his brother. What he did greatly offended the Lord. The author does not mince his words. The Lord was greatly offended. Verse 11. Thereupon Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he feared that Shelah also might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Does that shock you? Well, I hope it does, because it shocks me. She married who died. She was also made to marry Onan, who died. There's one son left, Shelah. Judah looks around in the yard. He sees two graves of his two sons, and he sees the younger boy, and he's like, And so this woman, who's Tamar, has lost two husbands and is a potential third husband, whom the father-in-law does not want to marry into Tamar because he's afraid that he will lose all his sons through this woman. And he says to her, why don't you go home to your father's house? It sounds absolutely interesting, eh? It's not. He kicks her out. Yes, we know that he's probably terrified, but he says to her, why don't you go home to your father's house and wait till Shelah is old enough, then you can come back and marry Shelah. But there's something else that he does to her. He says, go and remain a widow. Now, that means Tamar is still bound to remain in this relationship. It means Tamar is bound to stay in this marriage. Even though Tamar has to understand that she is no longer accepted in this household. She has to go back to her father's household, but she is not free to marry anyone else. Tamar is still bound to stay and to remain a widow. Now, in the scriptures, widows, orphans, that category of people, by law, they needed to be taken care of. By law, they needed to be protected. Who protects and who looks after Tamar? It is not Judah. It is not Shelah. It is not Onan. It is not She has to go back home. We have to look into our own lives though, We need to ask, does this still exist in our world today? How many widows do we have? How many wives have lost their husbands? What happens to them? How many of our women are left stranded? Everything that was supposed to be theirs has been taken away. How many of our women have become victims to society? How many of our women have become victims to the injustices that exist in the world? How many of our women have no voice? And so we find Tamar going back to her father's house. How does she explain herself when she goes back there? How many of our women feel that they have failed themselves, that they have failed their families? How many of our women feel that the one whom I loved, who has died, has let me down? Yes, the husband is dead, but she can't stay and be herself. She's bound because Tamar has been told that go there and remain a widow. Now let's go back and read verse 12. Years passed and Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And after Judah completed the period of mourning, he went up to Timnah for the shearing of the sheep in the company of his friends. When Tamar was told that her father-in-law was on his way up to Timnah to shear the sheep, she took off her widow's garb, veiled herself by covering herself with a shawl, and she sat down at the entrance, which is in the way to Timnah. And she was aware that although Shelah was now grown up, she had not been given to him in marriage. Now the story is, when Tamar hears that Judah is on his way to Timnah, and he knows that Shelah is now old, but Judah has been silent. And so what does Tamar do? Tamar says, I'm going to go and sit at the gate, at the entrance of the city. And as Judah passes by, he will notice me, but he will not know it is me. So she gets rid of these clothes as a widow, and she wears clothes and she poses as a prostitute. Mamma mia. Is she a victim or is she an intelligent woman? Does she allow things to be done on her behalf, or is she a go-getter that is going to claim that which belongs to her? And so she goes, and interestingly, she gets rid of the clothes of a widow and she gets a new personality. For a moment, let's just sit there. How many of us are willing to get rid of the abuse? How many of us are willing to get rid of the insults? How many of us are willing to fight gender-based violence and said, enough is enough, and say, that's what you used to do and you got away with it? Not today. When do we make decisions? When do we make fundamental decisions that we know are going to change our lives for better? And here you see a change, a turning point. Tamar is no longer a victim. Tamar is no longer a little girl that is spoken to. Tamar is no longer a little girl where they make decisions for her. She now changes. She now makes her own decision. She brings in a game changer. She is now a participant in this game. And this is how she does this. She poses as a prostitute. And so when Judah comes in, sees this prostitute, Judah does not recognize that this is Tamar. And so he sees a prostitute and he has a relations with her and he sleeps with her. Now let's read. This is absolutely interesting. Let's read it. In verse 16. So he went over to her at the roadside, and not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he said, "Come, let me have intercourse with you." She replied, "What will you pay me for letting you have intercourse with me?" Does this shock you? Well, she knows this is my father-in-law. He doesn't. She sits there waiting for him. She has planned it. She spent her time. Is this revenge or is this justice? What do you think? And continuing in verse 17, what she says in verse 16, "What will you pay me for letting you have intercourse with me?" He says to her, "I will send you a kid from my flock. I will give you a young goat." "Very well," she says, "provided you leave a pledge until you send it to me." Verse 18 is absolutely powerful. Judah asked, "What pledge am I to give you?" She answered, "Your seal, your cord, and your staff." Tamar is not a stupid woman. Why these symbols? What is behind these things she's asking for? A seal, this ring, it has a seal of authority. If Judah was to write anything and he has to close it with his seal, it becomes authoritarian and it becomes authenticated. It is the true document. And so Tamar takes from Judah his power to make any decision, his power to make anything to be true. He says, "Give me your seal, I will keep it. Give me the cord that you put around your waist, that shows your worth, that shows everything. Let me be the one that takes it." But the cord is already down because he's going to have sex with her. Is Tamar coming in not only as a daughter-in-law to Judah, is she coming in as a wife now to Judah? That's interesting. Is this a cord of chastity? Is he saying, "I want you no longer as my father-in-law, but I want you as a husband"? Tamar has been bound to remain a widow, And now Judah sleeps unknowingly to a widow. Is Judah committing adultery? And what is the punishment of adultery? Stoning to death. That's what the text will tell us. But interestingly, she does not only take the seal, the ring, she does not only take the cord, she also takes the staff. A shepherd, a sign of leadership, a sign of control. This woman is not stupid. She knows what she wants. She now wants to lead this house. She now wants to be in charge of the household. She now wants everything. She's coming back and getting everything she was told she will never have. Let's continue, dear friend. This is absolutely interesting. Let's continue. So he gave them to her and had intercourse with her, and she conceived by him. He doesn't know by now. When she went away, she took off her shawl and put on her widow's garb again. She went back to her old self. And Judah went back home. And Judah sends a kid by his friend. And when Judah gets there, he says, well, I'm here to give a kid to a woman who was there as a prostitute. And nobody knows. And said, well, we don't have any prostitutes here. And Judah says, well, it was my lucky day. And he goes back home. 3 months later, verse 24. Judah was told that his daughter-in-law Tamar had played the harlot and was then with child from her behavior. Bring her out, Judah said. She shall be burnt. Is this hypocrisy or what? Judah is prepared that Tamar should be burnt at stake because she has slept with a man. And Judah says the punishment for this woman, she should be burnt, she should be killed. Mama, what about us? Are we not too quick to judge sometimes? Do we not make judgments? But listen to what the Lord does and to what happens. In verse 25. But as they were bringing her out, she sent a word to her father-in-law. It is by the man to whom these things belong that I am with child. Please verify, she added, whose seal and cord and staff these are. And Judah recognized them and said, she is more in the right than I am, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. But he had no further relations with her. When the time for her delivery came, she was found to have twins in her womb. A woman who was supposed to have been killed goes back and says to the man who wants to kill her, please verify these things before you kill me, before you burn me alive. The father of my child had this seal, wore this belt, and carried this staff. What would you do to him? And Judah realizes he is the cause of this. Now, why is this also important for me? Nowhere in this chapter does the author tell us that the Lord was offended. No way. I have not seen it. If you see it, please show me. The moral of the story, or at the heart of the story, are a lot of questions. Was Tamar a victim or a game changer? in our families, in our lives, in our own personal lives? Are they things that we are not proud of? Are they things that we have done that if they ever came up to the public, we will be ashamed of? Are they people in our families, in our lives, that have done things that we cannot talk about? You know, if you go to the photo album, you know, in the good old days, there used to be a photo album where you will put a picture and you will close it and you put a picture. And so people will go through this photo album. You remember those photo albums? And if there was a picture that you didn't like, you either removed that picture or you covered it with another picture. Now imagine if you have a friend and they are looking at the photo albums and there is a picture of someone and they ask you, who is this? And this person has to be a member of your family, but you just like don't talk about it. And usually you say, it's a complicated story. It is a long story. I'll tell you this story. This is a story for another day. Tamar is one of those. But Tamar belongs to the family of Christ. There's nothing that God cannot use. May Almighty God be with us. May He protect us. May He bless us. I hope you enjoyed this series. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. And I ask you to please leave your comments so that I find your own insight into this. And subscribe if you have not, and hit that notification button so that we can see as many as we can. Have a wonderful day. May God bless you. Thank you.